The sound of the heavy cardstock hitting the bottom of the stainless steel trash can was louder than a gunshot in the quiet morning air. I stood there frozen. My hands are calloused and scarred from 40 years of pouring concrete and framing houses under the brutal Texas sun. But in that exact moment, they felt completely numb. I could not feel my fingers. I could barely feel my own heartbeat. Brittany is the girl I had raised as my own daughter for the past 15 years. She was standing right across at the massive marble kitchen island. Her eyes were cold. They were entirely devoid of the warmth I had tried so hard to cultivate since she was a teenager. "The greatest gift you can give me is if you do not show up," she spat. Her voice was dripping with absolute venom. "You are not my real father. You are just an outsider with a checkbook." Those words hit me so hard, I physically took a step back. An outsider with a checkbook. If you are watching this right now, please take a deep breath. Because what I am about to tell you is a story of ultimate betrayal. It is happening right inside the walls of my own home. Let me know in the comments where you are watching from. Hit that like button if you believe that a father is the man who steps up, not just the man who provides the biology. Your support helps me keep sharing my story with people who might be going through the exact same nightmare. Let me give you some context woven right into this horrible morning. I am Harrison Caldwell. I am 72 years old. I spent my entire life building a commercial construction empire from the dirt up. I did not inherit a single dime. Every penny I have, I bled for. And right now I was standing in the middle of a $1.2 million home in the Texas suburbs, a home that I bought in cash, a home that I put entirely in my name but opened up to my wife Cynthia and her daughter Brittany. I wanted them to have the beautiful life they never had. Just 20 minutes before this argument, I had been sitting in my home office down the hall. I had pulled out my leather checkbook, the very same checkbook she just insulted, and I wrote a check for $95,000. $95,000. Let that sink in for a moment. That was for her dream wedding. The caterers, the imported flowers, the custom dress, the live band. Everything she ever demanded I gave her without a second thought. I signed my name on that dotted line with a smile on my face. I honestly thought I was giving my little girl the happiest day of her life. And what did I get in return? A $2,000 custom-made wedding invitation printed on imported silk paper tossed into the garbage along with the coffee grounds and the eggshells. I looked down at the trash can. I could see the gold foil of my name, Harrison Caldwell, smeared with yesterday's waste. I looked back at Brittany. She was 28 years old, but right then she looked like a spoiled, entitled stranger. She crossed her arms tightly across her chest. She was waiting for me to yell. She was waiting for me to explode like the angry old man she probably told her fiancé Derek I was. But I did not yell. At 72 years of age, you learn that anger is a very cheap emotion. Silence is much more expensive. I turned my gaze slowly away from Brittany and looked at my wife of 15 years. Cynthia. She was standing at the end of the counter just a few feet away from the trash can. She was preparing a salad for lunch. Chop, chop, chop. The rhythmic sound of her expensive chef knife hitting the wooden cutting board echoed in the dead silence of the kitchen. Cynthia was 58 years old. When I first met her, she was a struggling single mother working 2 jobs. She was drowning in debt from her deadbeat ex-husband. I pulled her out of that life. I gave her the world. I gave her luxury security and a promise that she would never have to worry about money again. I raised her daughter as my own flesh and blood. Surely she would say something. Surely the woman I shared a bed with for a decade and a half would put down the knife look at her daughter and demand respect for the man who provided the very roof over their heads. I waited for her to defend me. I waited for her to tell Brittany to pick that expensive invitation out of the trash and apologize for her cruel words. Cynthia paused. She set the heavy metal knife down on the board. She slowly wiped her hands on a linen towel. Then she looked up. She did not look at Brittany. She looked straight at me, and she smirked. It was not a full smile. It was a tiny, almost imperceptible twitch at the corner of her mouth. A look of quiet, wicked satisfaction. A look that clearly said, "She put you exactly in your place, old man." Then, without saying a single word to defend my honor, she picked up the knife and went back to chopping the celery. Chop, chop, chop. The room suddenly felt incredibly cold. My chest tightened so hard I could barely breathe. It was not a heart attack. It was the sudden, horrifying realization that I was entirely alone in a house full of people. The daughter I financed absolutely despised me. The wife I saved was completely amused by my humiliation. I realized right then that this was not a sudden emotional outburst from a stressed-out bride. This was a calculated disrespect. They had already gotten exactly what they wanted. The $95,000 check was signed. It was sitting on the dining room table right now. They did not need the outsider anymore. They just needed his bank account. I did not say a single word. I simply turned around and walked out of the kitchen. I walked down the long hallway, my heavy boots making loud thuds against the hardwood floor. I could hear them whispering behind my back. I could almost feel their triumphant smiles burning into my spine. They thought they had won. They thought the clueless old man was just going to go out to his garage tinker with his tools and swallow the disrespect like he always did just to keep the peace. But they forgot one very important detail about who I am. You do not survive 40 years in the cutthroat commercial construction business by being a pushover. I know exactly how to build things up from nothing, but I also know exactly how to tear them down to the bare foundation. And I was about to demolish everything they loved. That evening, the house was suffocatingly quiet. I sat on the edge of the king-size bed in the master bedroom, staring out the window into the dark Texas night. The silence in the house was not a peaceful one. It was the kind of heavy, pregnant silence that comes just before a terrible storm. My blood was still boiling from the morning encounter. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that gold foil invitation sitting at the bottom of the trash can. I saw the smirk on Cynthia's face. I had spent the entire afternoon in my garage running the table saw just to drown out the sound of my own thoughts. I needed to control my temper. I could not afford to let raw emotion dictate my next move. The heavy oak bedroom door creaked open. I did not turn around. I could hear the soft padding of Cynthia's bare feet on the expensive Persian rug. She walked up behind me and gently placed her soft hands on my shoulders. Her fingers, adorned with the 2-carat diamond anniversary ring I had bought her 5 years ago, began to massage my tense muscles. It was a familiar gesture. A gesture that used to bring me deep comfort after a long day of reviewing blueprints and walking construction sites. But tonight, her touch felt entirely different. It felt cold and calculating. It felt like a predator testing the fences to see if the prey was still docile and trapped inside the cage. "Harrison, honey," she whispered. Her voice was trembling. It was an absolutely masterful performance. I could hear the forced catch in her throat, the artificial tears welling up in her eyes. "I am so incredibly sorry about what happened this morning in the kitchen." I turned my head slightly to look at her. A single tear rolled perfectly down her powdered cheek. She knelt beside the bed, resting her head against my knee like a repentant sinner. "You know exactly how Brittany gets. She is just being a complete bridezilla right now. The immense stress of planning this massive wedding is eating her alive. She is suffering from severe pre-wedding depression, and she is just lashing out at the person closest to her." I looked down at her, keeping my face perfectly blank. "Lashing out," I repeated slowly, letting the words hang in the air. "She threw a $2,000 invitation in the garbage and told me I was nothing but an outsider with a checkbook." Cynthia sighed heavily, gripping my rough hand tightly with both of hers. "I know, Harrison. I know it was terribly cruel. But you have to understand her deep psychological trauma. You have to look past the anger. Her biological father completely abandoned her when she was just a little girl. He walked out on us and never looked back. That kind of deep emotional pain never really heals. Now that she is about to get married and have a man promise to stay with her forever, all those childhood abandonment issues are violently bubbling to the surface. She is projecting all her repressed anger at her real father onto you. She is doing it simply because you are the only true father figure she has ever known. She does not actually mean those hurtful words. She is just a terrified little girl inside. Please forgive her. It was the perfect plausible lie. It was beautifully constructed, wrapped in modern therapy buzzwords, and designed to hit every single one of my protective instincts. For 15 years, I had been the shield that protected them from the harsh realities of the world. Cynthia knew exactly which buttons to push to make me feel like the strong, forgiving patriarch. Every fiber of my being wanted to stand up and scream. I wanted to shake her and demand to know why she smirked when her daughter humiliated me. I wanted to march down the hall, kick open Brittany's bedroom door, and demand my $95,000 back. My chest was tight with an explosive fury that threatened to shatter my ribs, but my 72-year-old wisdom kicked in. A younger man would have thrown a massive tantrum, caused a huge scene, and tipped his hand. A younger man would have demanded immediate respect and ruined his own leverage. But I am not a young, hot-headed man. I am a seasoned builder. And the first rule of demolition is that you never swing the sledgehammer until you know exactly which load-bearing walls to hit. If I exploded now, they would just label me as an abusive, angry old man. They would use my anger to justify their cruelty. I needed them to feel completely safe. I needed them to believe that their pathetic manipulation had worked flawlessly. I took a deep, slow breath, forcing my heart rate to steady. I reached out and gently patted Cynthia on her soft hair. "You are right," I said softly, my voice completely devoid of the rage that was burning a hole through my stomach. "It is a very stressful time for her. I know weddings can make people act totally out of character. I should not have taken it so personally." Cynthia looked up at me, her eyes shining with relief. The fake tear had dried up. "Thank you, Harrison. You are such a good, understanding man. So you will forgive her. You will let this go so we can focus on her big day." I forced a warm, gentle smile onto my face. "Of course," I replied smoothly. "I love you both. I do not want my presence to cause her any more anxiety. Tell Brittany she does not have to worry about me being at the wedding. I will stay completely out of her way. I will not attend. I just want her to be happy." Cynthia practically beamed. She leaned up and kissed my cheek, her entire body relaxing as she realized she had successfully managed the crisis. She truly believed she had won. She walked out of the bedroom with a light, victorious step, gently pulling the door shut behind her. The conflict seemed perfectly resolved on the surface. The house went back to being quiet. But as I sat alone in the dark bedroom, my gut was absolutely screaming. The pieces of the puzzle did not fit together. The math was fundamentally wrong. A daughter lashing out from pre-wedding jitters is one thing, but a wife smiling at her husband's humiliation is something else entirely. There was a much darker current flowing beneath the floorboards of my own house. The logic just did not add up. If Brittany truly hated me so much that she did not want me at the wedding, why did she wait until after I signed the massive check to tell me? She could have easily thrown me out of her life before taking my money. The timing was far too perfect. I had swallowed my pride for the night, but I was not going to swallow their lies anymore. The game had completely changed, and they had no idea I was even playing. Tomorrow morning, I would stop acting like a wounded father and start acting like the man who built an empire. I lay perfectly still for hours. Beside me, Cynthia's breathing slowed into the deep, rhythmic cadence of someone who had zero trouble sleeping at night. The woman had just manipulated her husband of 15 years, lied straight to his face, and now she was resting as peacefully as a newborn child. The sheer audacity of it kept my heart beating at a steady, heavy pace. I stared at the ceiling fan spinning lazily above us, watching the faint shadows cast by the moonlight, filtering through the blinds. The digital clock on my side of the bed silently clicked forward. 1:30, 1:45, 2 in the morning. I was wide awake, my mind replaying the morning kitchen scene over and over again, searching for the missing piece of the puzzle. I knew there was a reason she smirked. I knew there was a reason Brittany chose today, the exact day I wrote the first major installment for the wedding expenses, to throw her explosive tantrum. I just needed the hard proof. The bedroom was completely pitch black save for the faint ambient glow of the street lamp outside. Then suddenly, a sharp artificial blue light pierced the darkness. It came from Cynthia's side of the bed. Her silver iPad resting on the mahogany nightstand had just lit up with a new notification. Normally, I would never invade my wife's privacy. In 15 years of marriage, I had never once checked her phone, read her emails, or questioned who she was talking to. Trust was the absolute foundation of everything I believed in. But tonight, that foundation had been smashed into a million jagged pieces. I slowly turned my head. Cynthia did not even stir. She was buried deep under the heavy down comforter, softly exhaling. I listened to her breathing for another full minute, ensuring she was completely under. Carefully, I slid the covers off my legs. I rolled out of bed with the practiced silence of an old man who knows every creaky floorboard in his own house. I walked quietly around the foot of the bed and stood over her nightstand. The screen of the tablet was still glowing brightly in the dark room. I squinted against the harsh glare and leaned in to read the banner notification plastered across the lock screen. It was an incoming text message. The contact name was saved simply as Florist, but the message itself made my blood run absolutely ice cold. It read, "Did the clueless old man sign the $30K check yet? Derek needs the cash right now." I stood there frozen, the blue light illuminating my weathered hands. I read the words a second time, then a third time. "Did the clueless old man sign the $30K check yet? Derek needs the cash right now." My mind started working like a high-speed machine, processing the information, breaking down the raw data. A florist does not talk like that. A professional wedding vendor in an upscale neighborhood does not refer to the father of the bride as a clueless old man. A florist does not care about a $30,000 specific check, nor do they care if the groom Derek needs cash right now. The pieces of the puzzle began snapping together with terrifying clarity. The contact saved as Florist was not a florist at all. It was Derek, Brittany's fiancé, the man who sat at my dinner table every Sunday, drinking my imported wine and calling me sir. He was the one messaging my wife at 2 in the morning, asking if they had successfully extracted the money from my bank account, and Cynthia was saving his number under a fake vendor name to hide their late-night communications. The magnitude of the deception washed over me like a tidal wave of freezing water. This was not just a spoiled daughter lashing out. This was a highly coordinated financial conspiracy happening right under my roof. Suddenly, the explosive argument in the kitchen made perfect sense. It was a brilliantly executed diversion tactic. If Brittany played the role of the hysterical, traumatized bride who hated her stepfather, I would do exactly what Cynthia suggested. I would back off. I would stay completely away from the wedding planning, stay away from the venue, and most importantly, stay far away from the vendors. If I attended the meetings, if I asked to see the floral arrangements or the catering menus, I would eventually ask for the receipts. I would see that a $95,000 wedding was a complete fabrication. They needed me to hand over the blank checks and then disappear into the background out of guilt and shame. They needed the clueless old man to just fund the operation and stay quiet. The sheer genius of their wickedness was almost impressive. Almost. I gently tapped the screen of the iPad, turning it completely dark once again. I stood in the silent bedroom listening to the soft, rhythmic breathing of the woman who was actively conspiring to rob me blind. I felt a strange, chilling sense of calm wash over my entire body. The initial sting of the betrayal was gone, replaced by a cold, calculated focus. The raw emotion had evaporated, leaving behind nothing but the pure, unadulterated resolve of a businessman who had just discovered his partners were embezzling funds. They had severely underestimated the man they were dealing with. They thought my age made me weak, that my love made me blind, and that my money was theirs for the taking. I slowly walked back to my side of the bed and sat down on the edge of the mattress. I looked at my calloused hands in the dark. Tomorrow, the fishing trip would begin. But I was not going to a lake, and I certainly was not catching fish. I was going to hunt down every single dollar they stole, and I was going to burn their entire world to the ground. The morning sun crept through the shutters, casting long shadows across the floor. I was already out of bed, moving with deliberate slowness. I threw on my faded denim jacket and battered work boots, completing the costume of a harmless retiree heading out for a weekend on the water. In the kitchen, Cynthia stood by the espresso machine. She looked relaxed, wearing a silk robe I purchased during a trip to Italy. She poured coffee and pushed it across the granite counter with a practiced smile. She asked if I was sure I wanted to leave so close to the wedding, putting on a flawless mask of concern. I took a slow sip and told her it was the best thing for everyone. I told her I wanted to give her and Brittany space to manage details without my grumpy presence in their way. She nodded sympathetically, leaning over to kiss my cheek. She told me to catch a big bass and enjoy the quiet of Lake Travis. I grabbed my thermos, picked up my heavy canvas duffel bag, and walked out to my truck. I loaded 2 expensive fishing rods and a tackle box into the bed, making sure it was completely visible from the living room window. I climbed into the driver's seat, started the diesel engine, and pulled out of the driveway. I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw Cynthia on the porch waving goodbye. The moment my truck turned the corner, my demeanor shifted. The slumped shoulders of a defeated father vanished. My grip on the steering wheel tightened until my knuckles turned white. I did not merge onto the highway heading west. Instead, I took a sharp left turn, navigating through commuter traffic toward downtown Austin. My destination was not a quiet dock. It was the massive glass building of Texas Fidelity Bank, where I kept my accounts for 30 years. I parked in the visitor lot, grabbed a thick folder from the glove compartment, and walked straight through the revolving doors. I did not stop at the teller line. I walked directly past the security desk and headed straight for the glass corner office belonging to the senior branch manager. Martin was a sharp, meticulous man in his late 50s. We had done business together for decades. He personally oversaw the financing of my largest commercial construction projects. When he saw me walking toward his office with a grim look, he immediately stood up and closed his blinds. He knew that when Harrison Caldwell showed up unannounced, something was terribly wrong. I sat down in the heavy leather chair across from his mahogany desk and slid my personal checkbook across the smooth surface. I did not waste time with pleasantries. I looked Martin dead in the eyes and told him I needed an immediate comprehensive trace on a specific cashier check drawn from my primary account the previous afternoon. It was check number 4008, made out for exactly $95,000. Martin sensed the absolute urgency in my voice. He simply nodded, logged into his secure administrative terminal, and began typing rapidly. The silence in the office was deafening, broken only by the sharp clacking of his keyboard. After 3 agonizing minutes, Martin stopped typing. He leaned back in his chair, took off his reading glasses, and let out a troubled sigh. He turned his monitor around so I could see the screen. I leaned forward, my eyes scanning the dense financial data. I fully expected to see the money sitting in an escrow account belonging to a high-end wedding planning agency. That is what Cynthia explicitly promised me. She claimed the money was required up front to secure the catering, floral arrangements, and the grand ballroom. But the screen told a completely different story. The $95,000 check was never deposited into a commercial business account. It had been deposited directly into a private secondary checking account. And the name on that account was not a wedding planner. It was Cynthia Caldwell. My own wife deposited the massive check into a personal account she opened just 2 months ago, an account I had absolutely no knowledge of and no legal access to. But that was only the beginning of the nightmare. Martin pointed a pen at the lower half of the screen, highlighting a series of rapid transactions that occurred just hours after the initial deposit cleared. The money did not stay in her secret account. It was immediately broken down and dispersed. $30,000 was transferred via a wire directly to an account under the name Derek Vance, Brittany's supposedly wealthy fiancé. The message I intercepted at 2 in the morning suddenly made perfect sense. He needed the cash, and Cynthia dutifully funneled my money straight into his pocket. Another $15,000 was wired to an offshore investment platform, likely a desperate attempt by Derek to cover bad gambling losses. But the largest chunk of the money, a staggering $50,000, was wired out of state to a mysterious recipient in Nevada. The transaction record showed it was sent to an entity listed as the Silver State Wellness Center. I stared at the screen, my heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. There was no wedding planner. There was no grand ballroom. The entire $95,000 wedding budget was a meticulously crafted illusion. They were bleeding my accounts dry, laundering my hard-earned money right under my nose. I stood up slowly, thanking Martin for his discretion. He offered to call the authorities, but I raised my hand, stopping him. This was not a matter for police to mishandle. If I confronted Cynthia now, she would play the victim spin, another web of lies, and make me look like the villain. I needed absolute proof of where that Nevada money was going. I needed to see the bottom of this rabbit hole before I buried them in it. I walked out of Texas Fidelity Bank and climbed back into my truck. The midday sun was beating down on the asphalt, but I felt nothing but a lingering coldness in my chest. I sat in the driver's seat for a moment, letting the heavy diesel engine idle. My next stop was not a mystery. If Cynthia had completely fabricated the $95,000 budget, I needed to know what kind of wedding was actually happening this weekend. I pulled out of the parking lot and drove toward the edge of town, where the upscale event venues were located. The venue Brittany had supposedly booked was called the Whispering Pines Estate. It was a beautiful, sprawling property with manicured gardens and a massive glass conservatory. When I pulled up to the wrought iron gates, I noticed they were wide open. A few landscaping trucks were parked near the main entrance. I grabbed my worn leather notebook, smoothed out my expression to look like a mildly confused, doting father, and walked up the gravel path toward the main office. The front desk was chaotic, covered in floral arrangements and seating charts. Behind it stood a young woman with a clipboard frantically typing on her phone. I cleared my throat gently. She looked up startled, but quickly put on a professional smile. I introduced myself as Harrison Caldwell, the father of the bride for this weekend. Her face immediately lit up with recognition. She introduced herself as Melissa, the senior event coordinator for the property. She told me it was such a pleasure to finally meet me, noting that she had only ever dealt with my wife and daughter over the phone and through email. I gave her a warm, self-deprecating chuckle, leaning casually against the polished wooden counter. I told her I was just an old contractor who usually stayed out of the way of wedding planning, but I wanted to double-check the catering menu. I spun a little lie, saying I had a few elderly relatives coming who had severe dietary restrictions, and I just wanted to make sure the imported sea bass and the custom carving stations we paid for were properly prepared to accommodate them. Melissa stopped smiling. A look of genuine confusion washed over her face. She flipped through the thick stack of papers on her clipboard until she found the file labeled with Brittany and Derek's names. She ran her manicured finger down the itemized list and then looked back up at me, her brow furrowed. "Mr. Caldwell," she said slowly, her voice tinged with hesitation. "I am completely happy to check on dietary restrictions for your guests, but there is no imported sea bass or custom carving station on your catering order. In fact, you have opted for our standard tier buffet package. It includes roasted chicken, pasta salad, and dinner rolls. I kept my face perfectly still, though my jaw tightened involuntarily. A standard buffet package. Cynthia had spent weeks showing me glossy brochures of gourmet five-star catering options, insisting we needed to impress Derek's wealthy family. I played the part of the forgetful older man perfectly. I tapped my temple and let out a soft sigh, apologizing for my poor memory. I asked her if she would be so kind as to print me a copy of the final invoice just so I could get my own records straight before the big day. Melissa, eager to be helpful, clicked her mouse a few times and handed me a warm sheet of paper from the printer. My eyes scanned the black and white text. Venue rental, standard catering, basic folding chairs, and house linens. I looked at the bolded number at the very bottom of the page. Total cost $20,000 flat, not $95,000. 20. My own wife and stepdaughter were going to feed our guests cheap pasta and basic chicken while pocketing $75,000 of my hard-earned money. I looked at Melissa, keeping my voice incredibly calm and conversational. I thanked her for the printout and casually mentioned that I was the one writing the checks. I asked her if we were completely paid up or if I needed to cover a remaining balance today. Melissa shook her head, giving me a reassuring smile. "Oh no, sir, you are entirely paid in full," she said cheerfully. "Your wife took care of the final balance just this morning. Everything was wired directly from the Caldwell Family Trust, just like the initial deposit." The words hit me like a physical blow to the stomach. The Caldwell Family Trust. I stared at her, my mind racing to process the massive legal implications of what she had just said. I do not have a family trust. I have never established a trust in my entire life. All of my assets, my properties, and my liquid cash are held in my own individual name or under my commercial construction limited liability companies. Creating a family trust requires a mountain of legal paperwork, notarized signatures, and the direct involvement of estate attorneys. For Cynthia to be moving money out of a bank and into a venue under the guise of a Caldwell Family Trust meant she had forged my signature on legal documents of monumental scale. It meant she had created a shadow financial entity right behind my back to siphon and hide my wealth. She was not just stealing cash for a wedding. She was actively building a vast legal architecture to secretly drain my net worth. I carefully folded the invoice, slid it deep into my jacket pocket, and thanked Melissa for her excellent help today. I turned my back, walked out of the conservatory, and stepped into the blinding Texas heat. The fake fishing trip was entirely over. I was now standing in the middle of a massive financial crime scene. My wife had declared total war. She was about to learn that I owned the battlefield. I drove away from the Whispering Pines estate with icy focus burning in my chest. I did not go home. I did not go to my fake fishing spot at Lake Travis. Instead, I drove to a nondescript diner on the outskirts of Austin to meet a man named Vance. Vance was a former state trooper turned private investigator. I had used him over the years to run background checks on shady commercial suppliers. He was quiet, ruthlessly efficient, and possessed an uncanny ability to dig up the darkest secrets a person could hide. I slid into the vinyl booth across from him and handed him the folded bank printout and gave him one simple instruction. I needed to know who controlled the Silver State Wellness Center in Nevada, and I needed to know the final destination of every dollar that left my account. Vance took the paper, nodded once, and walked out. I spent the next 24 hours sitting in a cheap motel room, staring at the peeling floral wallpaper, waiting for the phone to ring. I kept my personal phone turned off, maintaining the perfect illusion of the peaceful fishing trip. By late the following afternoon, Vance called. He did not give me details over the phone. He just told me to meet him back at the diner immediately. When I sat down across from Vance again, he did not look at me with pity. He looked at me with the grim expression of a man delivering a terminal medical diagnosis. He placed a heavy manila folder on the sticky table and slid it slowly toward me. I opened it and stared at the top sheet. It was a complete financial autopsy of the $50,000 sent to Nevada. The Silver State Wellness Center was not a medical facility for physical ailments. It was an ultra-exclusive drug and alcohol rehabilitation clinic located just outside of Las Vegas. But the stolen money was not just paying for standard treatment. Vance tapped a glossy photograph firmly clipped to the second page of the file. The remaining $25,000 of the missing wedding budget had been wired directly to a luxury car dealership right on the Vegas Strip. It was used as a massive cash down payment on a brand new jet black Porsche Macan. I looked at the name legally registered to both the luxury vehicle and the penthouse rehab suite. It was a name I had not heard spoken aloud in my house for over a decade. The sole beneficiary of my hard-earned money was a man named Richard. I felt the air violently leave my lungs. Richard was Cynthia's ex-husband. He was Brittany's biological father. 10 years ago, Cynthia sat at my kitchen table crying softly into her hands as she told me Richard had died in a tragic motorcycle accident in Southern California. She told me he was a reckless addict who had finally paid the ultimate price for his destructive lifestyle. We even held a small memorial service in our own backyard so young Brittany could have proper closure. I had stood there under the oak tree holding a grieving teenage girl, promising her that I would always be her father and that she would never be abandoned again. It was all a complete malicious fabrication, a ghost story expertly designed to manipulate my deepest sympathies. Richard was not dead. He was very much alive, living a life of absolute luxury in Nevada, fully funded by the clueless old man in Texas. Cynthia had been actively funneling my money to him for God knows how long, keeping her supposedly dead ex-husband perfectly comfortable while I worked myself to the bone. Vance saw the profound shock registering on my exhausted face, but he was not entirely finished yet. He turned to the final page in the dossier. This was the piece of evidence that officially broke whatever remaining shred of humanity I still harbored for my wife and stepdaughter. It was a detailed, fully printed commercial flight itinerary. First-class passenger tickets from Las Vegas to Austin scheduled to safely arrive the exact day before the wedding ceremony. The solely designated passenger was Richard, and securely attached to the flight confirmation was an intercepted email correspondence between Cynthia Brittany and Richard. I read the words printed on the page, feeling my beating heart turn to absolute stone. Brittany had written, "I cannot wait to see you, Daddy. Everything is perfectly set up here. The idiot is staying far away from the venue just like we wanted, so you can walk me down the aisle just like we always planned. Thank you so much for the generous wedding gift." The generous wedding gift. She was openly thanking the deadbeat who abandoned her for the wedding that I was exclusively paying for. They had stolen my money, secretly sent it to the man who ruined their early lives, and now they were using my money to fly him out here first class so he could publicly play the role of the proud father. I was nothing but a silent, reliable bank vault to them, a vault they had finally figured out how to crack open. I closed the thick manila folder and slid it back to Vance. I told him to keep digging deeper. I wanted every single financial record, every hidden account, and every forged document he could find. I paid him in cash, walked out of the diner, and stood alone in the parking lot under the fading Texas sun. The agonizing grief was completely gone now. There was no sadness left in my body. Only a cold, highly calculated fury remained. The peaceful fishing trip was over, but the actual hunt had officially begun. They wanted to play a high-stakes game of deception, but they had absolutely no idea that I was holding all the winning cards and I was about to force them to go all in. I drove back to my neighborhood the following morning, making sure to park my heavy truck 3 blocks away, completely out of sight. I knew exactly where Cynthia and Brittany were. Cynthia had proudly written their schedule on the kitchen whiteboard, before I left on my supposed fishing trip. Today was the final extensive bridal fitting at an exclusive downtown boutique, followed by a champagne brunch with the bridesmaids. They would be gone for at least 5 hours. I walked down the familiar tree-lined street feeling like a stranger trespassing on private property. I slipped through the side gate, unlocked the back patio door, and stepped into the suffocating silence of my empty house. I did not waste a single second. I went straight to my garage, opened my heavy-duty tool chest, and pulled out my cordless titanium drill. I knew exactly what I was looking for. A few months ago, while running electrical wire for a ceiling fan, I had noticed a loose floorboard in the furthest, darkest corner of the attic. At the time, I thought it was just shoddy carpentry, but knowing what I knew now, I understood it was a highly secure hiding spot. I pulled down the creaky wooden stairs and climbed up into the oppressive, sweltering heat of the Texas attic. The air was thick with dust and the smell of old insulation. I crawled on my hands and knees over the wooden joists, carefully navigating past stacked cardboard boxes of Christmas ornaments. I reached the far corner wedged under the sloping roof. I slid my calloused fingers under the edge of the loose plywood floorboard and pulled it up. There, resting quietly in the dark cavity, was a heavy, fireproof steel lockbox. It was a sophisticated model, the kind that required both a digital code and a physical key. But a lockbox is only an obstacle if you care about keeping it intact. I am a builder. I know how to break metal. I set the heavy box on a solid wooden beam, positioned the tip of my drill bit directly into the center of the keyhole, and pulled the trigger. The loud, high-pitched screech of grinding metal echoed through the empty attic. Silver shavings flew through the hot air as the titanium bit chewed right through the locking mechanism. With a sharp crack, the internal tumblers shattered. I popped the heavy lid open. The box was packed to the brim with neatly organized folders. I reached in and pulled out the first stack of papers. They were not bank statements. They were printed emails and handwritten letters, a physical archive of their absolute contempt for me. I sat there in the sweltering heat, reading years of private conversations between Cynthia Brittany and Derek. They documented every fake smile, every manipulated argument, and every calculated move they had made to isolate me from my wealth. One letter from Brittany, dated 3 years ago, casually joked about how easy it was to get me to pay for her expensive college tuition. She wrote that all she had to do was cry and call me her hero, and the clueless old man would write a check before dinner. Derek had replied to that email, adding that they just needed to keep the golden goose fat and happy until the big payday. I read their mocking words, feeling the last remaining threads of my affection for them disintegrate. They had viewed my love as a weakness, my generosity as a joke, and my presence in my own home as an unfortunate inconvenience they merely had to tolerate. But the letters were just the appetizer to a much more sinister main course. I tossed the mocking correspondence aside and dug deeper into the heavy steel box. At the very bottom, buried beneath the letters, was a thick manila folder labeled with a red marker. It simply said, "Medical and Legal." I opened the flap and pulled out a stack of incredibly official-looking documents. My eyes scanned the thick letterhead of a prominent neurological clinic in Austin. I began to read the dense medical terminology, and my blood ran absolutely cold. These were comprehensive psychiatric evaluations, deeply detailed medical histories, and sworn affidavits from a doctor I had never even met. They detailed a tragic rapid cognitive decline. They described severe memory loss, aggressive behavioral outbursts, and a complete inability to manage personal finances. The patient named on every single page was Harrison Caldwell. According to these highly official, fraudulent documents, I was suffering from advanced aggressive dementia. I flipped frantically through the thick stack of papers. At the bottom of several consent forms and legal waivers, I saw my own signature. It was a flawless, masterful forgery. Cynthia had practiced my handwriting until she could perfectly replicate the exact slope of my letters. I sat back against the dusty wooden beams, the hot air completely knocked out of my lungs. The wedding scam, the stolen money, the secret rehabilitation center for her ex-husband. All of it paled in comparison to the sheer magnitude of what I was holding. This was not just a plot to steal $95,000. This was a meticulously orchestrated legal assassination. They were building an impenetrable paper trail to completely strip me of my human rights. They planned to use these forged medical documents to declare me legally incompetent. I realized with horrifying clarity exactly why they were in such a desperate rush to get Derek and Brittany married, and why they needed to drain my liquid cash right now. Once the wedding was completely paid, for the final phase of their master plan would officially begin. They were going to lock me inside a terrible state-run facility to slowly rot away. I carefully gathered the heavy files and placed them securely into my canvas duffel bag. I was going to use their own forged paperwork to seal their ultimate fate right then and there. I climbed down the wooden attic stairs, the canvas duffel bag slung heavily over my shoulder. The suffocating heat of the upper rafters gave way to the cool air-conditioned silence of the house. I did not bother putting the floorboard back. Let them come home and find the empty hole. Let them feel the creeping terror of knowing their darkest secrets had been unearthed. I walked out the back door, locked it behind me, and marched straight to my truck. I threw the heavy bag onto the passenger seat and started the engine. I did not drive to the police station. The police are reactionary. They only arrive after the damage is done. I needed a preemptive strike. I needed a butcher in a tailored suit. I merged onto the highway, heading straight for the sleek glass towers of downtown Austin. My destination was the law firm of Pierce & Associates. Mitchell Pierce was not a friendly family attorney. He was a ruthless, cold-blooded estate lawyer who specialized in high-net-worth divorces and hostile asset protection. He was the kind of man you hired when you wanted to completely obliterate your opponent legally and financially. I parked in the underground garage, rode the private elevator up to the 40th floor, and walked past his receptionist without an appointment. When I pushed open the heavy oak door to his corner office, Mitchell looked up from his computer. He was a sharp-featured man with cold gray eyes and zero tolerance for wasted time. He saw the grim, hardened look on my weathered face and immediately instructed his secretary to hold all his incoming calls for the rest of the afternoon. I walked over to his massive mahogany desk, unzipped the canvas duffel bag, and dumped the entire contents of Cynthia's hidden lockbox right onto his immaculate blotter. The thick medical files, the forged legal documents, the mocking letters, and the bank trace printouts spilled out in a chaotic pile. Mitchell did not ask any questions. He simply put on his reading glasses, picked up the first stack of papers, and began to read. The silence in the massive corner office was profound. For 20 straight minutes, the only sound was the sharp rustle of thick paper turning and the faint hum of the city traffic 40 stories below. I watched his face closely. Mitchell is a man who makes a living dealing with greedy spouses and treacherous heirs. He rarely shows any emotion. But as he read through the psychiatric evaluations and the forged medical consent forms, his jaw muscles tightened visibly. He set the final piece of paper down, took off his glasses, and looked at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated grimness. "Harrison," he said, his voice low and incredibly serious. "In my 25 years of practicing law, I have seen wives hide money, and I have seen children steal inheritance. But this is a masterpiece of pure malice. They are not just trying to rob you. They are actively trying to erase you from society. If you are listening to this right now, please hit that like button if you think I should burn their entire world to the ground." Because what Mitchell told me next made my blood run absolutely cold. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk, and began to lay out the brutal reality of the situation. He explained the dark mechanics of what they were actually attempting to do. The $95,000 wedding scam and the secret payments to the Nevada Rehabilitation Clinic were just the initial funding phases. The real prize was the house and my massive retirement portfolio. Mitchell picked up the forged neurological evaluation. He explained that under Texas law, establishing an involuntary guardianship over an elderly person requires a doctor to certify that the individual is completely incapacitated. Cynthia had found a corrupt or highly negligent doctor willing to sign off on a severe dementia diagnosis without ever physically examining me. Armed with this forged medical history, her next step would be to march into a probate court immediately after the wedding. She would present herself as the terrified, loving wife, struggling to care for a deeply aggressive, mentally incompetent husband. Mitchell broke down the specific property laws of Texas. Texas is a community property state. Normally, that simply means assets acquired during the marriage are split equally. But the $1.2 million house we lived in and the bulk of my commercial wealth were strictly premarital assets. They belonged solely to me. Cynthia had absolutely no legal right to sell the house or liquidate my primary accounts under normal circumstances. Even in a standard divorce, she would only walk away with a fraction of my current net worth. She knew this. That is exactly why she did not just file for a divorce. A divorce would leave her relatively poor. But a medical conservatorship would give her absolute total control over every single penny I ever earned. Once a judge declared me legally incompetent and appointed her as my primary guardian, she would have the unilateral power to sell my premarital properties, drain my private accounts, and lock me in a subpar state-run nursing facility. She could effectively take everything I owned, hand it over to her deadbeat ex-husband and her spoiled daughter, and leave me to rot in a sterile room until the day I died. I listened to his clinical explanation, feeling a dark, heavy weight settle firmly into my chest. The sheer scale of their cruelty was breathtaking. They had sat at my dinner table, smiled in my face, and planned my absolute destruction. I looked at Mitchell and asked if their forged paperwork was enough to succeed. Mitchell leaned back, steepled his fingers, and looked at the evidence. "If you had not found this, they would execute it flawlessly," he replied. "The war room is officially open for battle." Mitchell slid the thick stack of papers across the mahogany desk, tapping his silver pen against the crisp letterhead of a neurological clinic. He told me to look closely at the signature of the attending physician at the bottom of the page. The name printed in bold black ink was Dr. Aris Thorne. Mitchell explained that this psychiatrist was well known in the corrupt circles of the local legal community. He was a man who had narrowly avoided losing his medical license on 3 separate occasions for writing fraudulent prescriptions and providing questionable expert testimony. For the right amount of cash, Dr. Thorne would willingly diagnose a completely healthy person with whatever condition his paying client requested. Cynthia and Derek had clearly pooled their stolen resources to purchase his illegal services. Mitchell pointed to a specific paragraph detailing a fictitious private consultation that supposedly took place 2 months ago. According to this fabricated medical record, I had become violently disoriented during a routine checkup, unable to remember my own date of birth or the first name of my own wife. I sat perfectly still, listening as my lawyer read the clinical descriptions of my supposed mental decay out loud. The detailed report painted a tragic picture of a broken man rapidly losing his grip on reality, labeling me a severe physical danger to both myself and others around me. The puzzle pieces finally fit together with frightening precision when Mitchell pulled up Derek's financial background on his computer monitor. Derek was not the highly successful young entrepreneur he always pretended to be at our quiet Sunday dinners. He was actually drowning in a massive ocean of inescapable debt. Mitchell had utilized his private resources to run a thorough background check. He discovered that Derek owed hundreds of thousands of dollars to illegal sports bookies, high-interest payday lenders, and failed business partners. The $30,000 Cynthia had secretly wired him in the middle of the night was just a tiny drop in the vast ocean of his complete financial ruin. Derek desperately needed a massive, life-changing payday, and Cynthia desperately needed a willing partner to help her execute a highly complex, illegal legal maneuver. They were the absolute perfect match of toxic desperation and pure, unadulterated greed. Mitchell calmly explained that the $95,000 wedding scam was merely their initial pilot program. It was a carefully orchestrated test run designed to see exactly how easily they could quietly siphon liquid cash from my primary banking accounts without triggering any immediate financial alarms. Once they successfully pulled off the fake budget wedding, the main phase of their sinister operation would finally commence. Their dark timeline was meticulously planned down to the very last microscopic detail. Exactly 1 week after Brittany and Derek returned from their tropical honeymoon, Cynthia was going to take these forged medical documents directly to a sympathetic probate judge. She would stand solemnly in front of the quiet court, crying those exact same perfect fake tears she used on me in the dark bedroom, and present herself as a terrified, exhausted primary caregiver. She would falsely testify under oath that my aggressive dementia had rapidly escalated to a terrifying point where I could no longer be safely managed within our own home. The presiding judge, presented with multiple sworn legal affidavits from a fully licensed medical professional, would immediately grant an emergency medical conservatorship without a second thought. The devastating realization crashed over my entire body with the heavy, suffocating force of a collapsing brick wall. They did not just want to steal the remaining wedding money. That cash was just temporary pocket change to greedy people like them. Their ultimate terrifying goal was absolute uncontested legal control over my entire life's hard work. By successfully having me officially declared legally incompetent, Cynthia would instantly gain total power of attorney over everything I possessed. She would immediately seize the $1.2 million suburban house that I bought with my own blood, sweat, and tears. She would instantly gain completely unrestricted access to my entire commercial retirement portfolio, a massive fund I had spent 40 grueling years painstakingly building from the bare ground up. I would be instantly stripped of my state driver's license, all my personal credit cards, and my most basic human rights. I would not even have the legal authority to hire a defense lawyer to protect myself, because in the strict eyes of the law I would be considered a mentally incapacitated dependent, completely devoid of free will. Every single dollar I had ever earned pouring concrete framing houses and negotiating commercial building contracts under the scorching Texas sun would instantly become their personal piggy bank. Derek would finally pay off his massive gambling debts and continue to fund his lavish fake lifestyle. Cynthia would maintain her luxurious standard of living, free from the burden of pretending to play the role of the loving wife. And Brittany would have her unearned inheritance, all while her biological father lived comfortably in his Nevada penthouse suite. The sheer evil of their plan left a metallic taste lingering in my mouth. I had invited these people into my home. I had fed them, clothed them, and protected them from a cold world. In return, they had dug a dark grave for me, and they were waiting for the wedding reception to be over before they pushed me in and buried me alive. I looked at Mitchell sitting across the desk. The cold gray eyes of the estate lawyer met mine with understanding. I asked him if we could stop them before they filed the paperwork with the county court. Mitchell slowly shook his head, a dark, predatory smile forming on his face. He told me that stopping them was not enough punishment for this crime. We were not just going to stop them. We were going to let them walk into their own trap, and then we were going to destroy them. I sat back in the heavy leather chair and let Mitchell's promise of complete destruction hang in the quiet air of the office. Before I could respond, Mitchell reached back into the scattered pile of documents on his desk. He pulled out one final item that had been buried beneath the psychiatric evaluations. It was not a legal document or a forged medical record. It was a tri-fold glossy brochure printed on cheap, flimsy paper. He slid it slowly across the smooth mahogany wood until it rested directly in front of me. I looked down at the cover. The faded letters at the top read, "Shady Pines Care Facility." Below the title was a deeply depressing stock photograph of an elderly man staring blankly out a barred window. I picked up the brochure and opened it. The inside was filled with vague promises of comprehensive round-the-clock care and secure memory units. But even through the heavily edited marketing photographs, the truth was blatantly obvious. The rooms looked cramped and sterile, resembling prison cells far more than comfortable living quarters. The floors were covered in cheap institutional linoleum, and the perimeter fences shown in the background of the courtyard were topped with heavy security wire. I looked up at Mitchell, my expression hardening. Mitchell leaned forward, his gray eyes locked onto mine. He told me that he had his private investigator look into Shady Pines the moment he saw the brochure in the pile. It is not an exclusive retirement community. It is a severely underfunded, notoriously terrible state-run asylum located 3 hours deep into the desolate Texas Panhandle. It is the exact kind of facility where the state sends people who have absolutely zero remaining family members to advocate for them. The state health department has cited them dozens of times for severe negligence, unsanitary living conditions, and the heavy over-medication of their vulnerable patients. Cynthia did not just want to put me in a home. She deliberately sought out the absolute worst, most isolated facility she could legally find within state lines. Her goal was not to make sure I received adequate medical care for my supposed dementia. Her goal was to completely drug me into a permanent stupor and lock me away in a dark room where no one would ever hear from me again. She wanted me to quietly rot in a heavily guarded, miserable asylum, while she and her daughter drank imported champagne in the multi-million-dollar home that I built for them. As the horrific reality of that cheap, glossy brochure sank into my mind, something fundamentally broke inside of me. But it was not my spirit. The profound sadness, the heavy grief, and the agonizing pain of a broken heart completely vanished. The warmth of a loving husband and a devoted father evaporated into the cold, heavily air-conditioned air of the law office. In its place, a dark, familiar energy began to spread through my veins. It was the exact same ruthless, uncompromising energy that I had used 40 years ago when I started my commercial construction business with nothing but a rusted pickup truck and a shovel. Back then, I dealt with corrupt suppliers, vicious competitors, and brutal labor unions. I survived by being smarter, tougher, and significantly more merciless than the men trying to crush me. I had buried that dark side of myself when I married Cynthia, thinking I no longer needed to be a ruthless predator. I thought I had earned the right to be a soft, forgiving family man. But staring at the brochure for the asylum they intended to be my final resting place, I remembered exactly who I was. I am Harrison Caldwell. I build towering skyscrapers from dirt, and I crush concrete into dust. I slowly folded the Shady Pines brochure and placed it neatly into the breast pocket of my faded denim jacket. I wanted to keep it directly over my heart as a permanent reminder of their absolute treachery. Every time I felt a fleeting moment of pity for my wife or my stepdaughter over the next 2 weeks, I would feel the sharp edge of that cheap paper against my chest, and I would remember the dark cell they had specifically chosen for me. I looked across the desk at Mitchell. I did not ask him if we had a solid chance of winning. I simply asked him where we were going to place the dynamite. Mitchell smiled a genuine, terrifying smile that matched the newfound darkness in my own soul. For the next 3 hours, we sat in that secure office and meticulously drafted a comprehensive blueprint for their complete financial and legal annihilation. We analyzed every single loophole in the Texas Community Property Code, every banking regulation regarding offshore asset transfers, and every liability clause in the commercial real estate market. We did not build a defense strategy. We built a highly sophisticated, inescapable trap designed to strip them of every single asset they mistakenly believed they controlled. When the plan was completed, the sun had set over the Austin skyline. I stood up from the leather chair, feeling incredibly focused. I shook Mitchell's hand. I grabbed my canvas duffel bag, leaving the forged medical documents securely locked, and walked out of the towering glass building. I drove my diesel truck back to my quiet suburban neighborhood. As I pulled into the wide driveway of my $1.2 million home, I saw the warm, inviting lights glowing softly through the front windows. I knew Cynthia and Brittany were inside, likely reviewing catering menus and laughing about how incredibly easy it was to manipulate the clueless old man. I slowly turned off the engine. I practiced my most convincing, harmless smile in the rearview mirror. I was ready to walk through that front door and play my part flawlessly. The helpless victim was completely dead. The architect of their absolute ruin had officially arrived. I grabbed the canvas duffel bag from my truck, making sure the forged medical documents were securely buried. I took a deep breath of humid evening air. I let tension drain from my shoulders, practicing the slight stoop of a tired, aging man. I walked up the paved driveway of my home, gravel crunching softly beneath my heavy boots. Through the large front window, I saw the warm, golden light of the living room. I pushed the heavy oak door open. The smell of roasted garlic immediately hit me. It was a perfectly crafted domestic illusion. Cynthia was standing in the open kitchen pouring a glass of expensive red wine. When she heard the door close, she turned around. She wore a flawless mask of sweet wifely relief. "Harrison, you are home early," she said, her voice dripping with artificial warmth. She walked briskly across the hardwood floor to greet me. She wrapped her arms around my neck, pressing her cheek against my rough jacket. I smelled the familiar scent of her expensive perfume, a scent that used to bring me comfort, but now only reminded me of the profound deception rotting at the core of our marriage. I gently patted her back, forcing my muscles to remain relaxed. I played my part with the exact same calculated precision she had used on me. I caught nothing but an old boot and a sunburn. I chuckled softly, letting a weary sigh escape my lips. I told her the fish were not biting, and I missed the comfort of my own bed. Cynthia smiled a sickeningly sweet expression and told me she was incredibly glad I was back. At that moment, footsteps echoed from the top of the grand staircase. Brittany walked down the carpeted steps holding her phone. When she saw me standing in the foyer, she froze. Her posture immediately stiffened, and her eyes narrowed defensively. She was bracing herself for an argument. She was expecting the angry, offended stepfather to finally explode and demand an apology for the $2,000 wedding invitation she had viciously thrown into the kitchen trash can 3 days ago. But I was not going to give her the satisfaction of an argument. I dropped my canvas duffel bag onto the floor with a heavy thud and took a slow, deliberate step toward the bottom of the stairs. I looked up at the girl I had raised, the girl who was actively conspiring to lock me in a state-run asylum so her deadbeat father could walk her down the aisle on my dime. I let my shoulders slump forward, projecting complete and utter defeat. "Brittany, sweetheart," I said softly, keeping my voice gentle and slightly cracked with feigned emotion. "I want to apologize to you." The defensive wall she had instantly put up seemed to crack just a fraction. She blinked clearly, caught off guard by my incredibly calm demeanor. I walked slightly closer, resting my calloused hand on the smooth wooden banister. "I have had a lot of time to sit alone out on the lake and think about things," I continued, letting a convincing look of remorse wash over my weathered face. "And I realized that I have been incredibly selfish. This is your special time. This is the most important day of your entire life, and the absolutely last thing you need is a grumpy, stubborn old man causing you any unnecessary stress." I looked over at Cynthia, who was standing perfectly still, watching the exchange with wide, calculated eyes. I turned my attention back to my stepdaughter. "You were completely right the other morning," I said, forcing the words through my teeth, while maintaining a warm, loving smile. "I am just your stepfather. I will never fully understand the immense pressure you are under right now, and I should never have made you feel guilty about your emotions. Your mother explained everything to me. I know you are struggling with the deep pain of your past, and I just want you to have the absolute perfect wedding day." Brittany stared at me, her mouth slightly parted in sheer disbelief. The cruel, entitled bridezilla persona completely vanished, replaced by a sudden, overwhelming sense of arrogant victory. I took another deep breath, delivering the final blow of my performance. "That is why I have decided to completely remove myself from the equation," I told her quietly. "I do not want my presence at the venue to cast a dark shadow over your beautiful celebration. I have a few old construction buddies down in Florida who have been begging me to come visit for years. I am going to book a flight and spend your entire wedding weekend down there. I will be completely out of the state, out of your hair, and out of your way. You and your mother can handle the final vendor payments and the ceremony details without me looking over your shoulder. I just want you to be perfectly happy, Brittany. That is my only wish for you." The silence in the grand foyer was absolute. For a long, terrifying moment, nobody said a single word. I watched the rapid calculation happening behind their eyes. They were completely processing the massive unearned victory I had just handed them on a silver platter. I was giving them exactly what they desperately wanted, completely, voluntarily. Brittany slowly walked down the remaining stairs, a bright, triumphant smile spreading across her face. She stepped forward and threw her arms around me, hugging me tightly. "Oh, Harrison, thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with fake gratitude. "Thank you so much for understanding. It really means the absolute world to me." I stood there awkwardly, returning the embrace of a venomous snake, staring over her shoulder directly at Cynthia. My wife was looking right back at me, and there it was. The exact same microscopic smirk she had worn 3 days ago. The trap was now perfectly and permanently set. Excellent. The next 2 weeks became a masterclass in psychological endurance. I woke up every single morning, drank coffee with my wife, and listened to her chatter endlessly about flower arrangements and seating charts. I smiled. I nodded. I played the role of the docile, defeated older man perfectly. I even helped her load a few boxes of wedding favors into her car. She was so entirely consumed by her arrogant victory that she failed to notice the subtle shift in my routine. I was no longer going to my woodworking shop. I was going to war. Exactly 14 days before the scheduled wedding ceremony, I walked back into the towering glass building in downtown Austin. Mitchell Pierce was waiting for me in his corner office, a thick stack of finalized legal documents resting neatly on his mahogany desk. He looked up, his cold gray eyes acknowledging that the time for planning had officially ended. Today, we were executing Phase 1 of the demolition. We were going to systematically drain the financial swamp that was feeding their toxic, parasitic lifestyle. I sat down in the heavy leather chair, and Mitchell handed me a silver pen. He explained the precise legal mechanics of what we were about to do. Texas marital law heavily favors the spouse who brings established wealth into the marriage, provided that wealth was properly documented. When I married Cynthia 15 years ago, I did not force her to sign a prenuptial agreement. I was blinded by love and thought such documents were an insult to a genuine relationship. She quietly assumed this meant half of everything I owned automatically belonged to her. She was catastrophically wrong. Mitchell had spent the last 3 days tracking the origin of every single dollar in our joint checking and savings accounts. He legally proved that the vast majority of those funds were generated from the direct sale of commercial properties I had purchased decades before I even met her. Under the strict letter of the law, those funds remained my sole separate property. I had the absolute unilateral right to move them wherever I wanted, whenever I wanted, without needing a single drop of her consent. I signed the first transfer authorization. In an instant, a massive 6-figure sum evaporated from the joint savings account Cynthia had been using to secretly funnel cash to her ex-husband in Nevada. We did not just move the money to another local bank. Mitchell had established a highly secure, private limited liability company based offshore. The money was wired instantly, vanishing behind a completely impenetrable wall of international corporate privacy laws. By the time I set the silver pen down, the primary joint accounts that Cynthia treated as her personal endless wealth machine were completely hollowed out. They held exactly $0 and 0 cents. But draining the liquid cash was only the first half of the strike. I needed to cut off her credit lines completely. For 15 years, Cynthia had carried a premium platinum credit card with my name on the primary account. She used it to buy designer shoes, expensive lunches, and lavish spa treatments. I picked up my phone and called the dedicated customer service line for my wealth management tier. I identified myself, provided my security passcodes, and calmly instructed the representative to immediately freeze all secondary cards attached to my primary profile. I claimed I suspected fraudulent activity and explicitly ordered them not to issue any new cards or authorize any override charges under any circumstances whatsoever. The representative confirmed the action. With a few simple clicks on a keyboard hundreds of miles away, Cynthia's shiny platinum card became nothing more than a worthless piece of plastic. Mitchell watched me hang up the phone, a grim smile playing on his lips. We had successfully severed their main financial artery completely. They were now completely cut off from the Caldwell empire. The true beauty of Phase 1 was the absolute silence of it. Banks do not immediately call the secondary cardholder when an account is drained or a card is frozen by the primary owner. Cynthia would remain completely oblivious to the fact that her financial world had just been totally annihilated. She would continue to drive around the upscale neighborhoods of Austin in her luxury SUV, completely confident that the $95,000 wedding scam was running smoothly. She would continue to text Derek late into the night, promising him that the clueless old man's fortune was almost entirely theirs for the taking. I walked out of Mitchell's office and stepped into the bright Texas sunlight. I felt lighter than I had in years. The heavy burden of betrayal was entirely gone, replaced by the incredibly satisfying momentum of pure justice. I imagined Cynthia standing at the checkout counter of some exclusive downtown boutique in the coming days. I pictured her casually handing her premium card to the cashier, expecting the usual deferential treatment, only to watch the machine flash a bright red, declined message. She would probably laugh it off at first, blaming a simple bank error. She would try another card, and then another, until the horrifying realization finally began to creep up her spine. But by the time she fully realized that the money was completely gone, it would be far too late to do anything about it. She could not dare to call the police for help simply because she was already actively committing massive, highly illegal financial fraud against an unsuspecting elderly dependent. She could not even confront me about the missing funds because I was flawlessly playing the pathetic role of the submissive, apologetic husband who was supposedly preparing to fly out to Florida. She was officially trapped in a cage of her own making, completely starved of resources and entirely unaware that the walls were rapidly closing in around her. The massive financial swamp was officially drained dry. Now it was finally time to start dismantling the fake wedding venue. The massive financial swamp was officially drained dry. Now it was finally time to start dismantling the fake wedding venue. I drove my truck back to my quiet suburban neighborhood, but I did not pull into my own driveway. Instead, I parked 3 streets over near a small community park lined with towering oak trees. I turned off the diesel engine, rolled down the windows to let in the warm afternoon breeze, and pulled my worn leather notebook from the glove compartment. Inside were the direct contact numbers for every single vendor associated with Brittany and Derek's upcoming wedding. I took a slow, deep breath, reached for my cell phone, and prepared to systematically erase the happiest day of their lives. My first call was to Melissa, the cheerful event coordinator at the Whispering Pines estate. The phone rang twice before she picked up, her voice bright and professional. I immediately adopted a somber, heavy tone, the kind of voice a man uses when he is delivering terrible news. "Melissa, it is Harrison Caldwell," I said softly. "I am calling under incredibly difficult circumstances." She immediately dropped her cheerful pitch, sensing the gravity in my voice. I told her that we were facing an unexpected, devastating family emergency. I explained that due to severe, unforeseen medical and legal complications, the wedding simply could not move forward. I instructed her to cancel the venue reservation entirely. Melissa gasped, offering her deepest condolences and asking if there was anything she could do to help us postpone the date. I thanked her for her immense kindness, but firmly told her that postponement was not an option. The wedding was permanently canceled. Since I was the sole name on the financial checks and the primary contact for the trust, I requested that the standard cancellation refund be issued immediately. Because we were exactly 14 days out, The contract stipulated I was entitled to a 50% refund on the $20,000 budget package. I gave her the routing number to my newly established offshore limited liability company. She processed the cancellation right then and there. With a few clicks of her mouse, the grand ballroom was gone. I ended the call and crossed the venue off my list with a thick black pen. The feeling of pure, unchecked power was intoxicating. I was dismantling their grand illusion brick by imaginary brick. Next on my list was the catering company. I dialed the number and spoke to the head chef. I delivered the exact same tragic script. A sudden family emergency. A deeply painful decision. A permanent cancellation. The chef was sympathetic but reminded me of the strict cancellation policy regarding food orders. I told him to keep his deposit, but to cancel the order for the roasted chicken, the pasta salad, and the dinner rolls. I made sure to officially withdraw my financial authorization for any future charges, explicitly warning him that any further attempts to bill my accounts would be flagged as fraudulent. He agreed, wishing my family the best during our difficult time. I hung up the phone. The guests were now officially starving. I did not waste a single second. I moved straight down the list. I called the local boutique florist, who was tasked with delivering the basic centerpieces and the bridal bouquet. I spoke to the owner, a sweet older woman who had spent hours going over flower arrangements with Cynthia. I used my most heartbroken, gentle voice to tell her the wedding was off. I told her the family was completely devastated, but we had no other choice. She offered to send a complimentary bouquet to our house to lift our spirits, but I politely declined, telling her that the sight of flowers would just be too painful for my wife and stepdaughter right now. I secured the refund for the unused floral budget, directing the money straight into my secure corporate account. The beautiful white roses and the elegant centerpieces evaporated into thin air. Finally, I called the entertainment company to cancel the local wedding band and the master of ceremonies. The booking agent tried to argue, pointing out that their musicians had turned down other lucrative gigs for this specific weekend. I did not argue back. I simply cited the contract clauses authorized the penalty fees and officially terminated their services. The music completely stopped. I sat in the cab of my truck staring down at my leather notebook. Every single vendor was crossed out. The entire logistical infrastructure of the wedding had been thoroughly and legally annihilated. There would be no venue, no food, no flowers, and no music. The only thing left of Brittany and Derek's magnificent wedding was a pile of useless printed invitations and a very expensive white dress hanging in a closet. I leaned back against the headrest, feeling a profound sense of absolute closure. For weeks, they had been plotting behind my back, mocking my age and spending my money to fly a deadbeat father across the country. They thought they were the grand architects of my ultimate destruction. They had absolutely no idea that I had just quietly pressed the detonator on their entire operation. I had effectively canceled a wedding that they believed was completely paid for and secured. The most beautiful part of this phase was the sheer isolation of my actions. Because I had used the excuse of a severe family emergency, the vendors would respectfully keep their distance. They would not call Cynthia or Brittany to confirm the terrible news, out of respect for our supposed grieving process. The silence would remain completely unbroken until the very last possible moment. I put my notebook back into the glove compartment, started the heavy diesel engine, and pulled out of the park. I drove back to my house, pulled into the driveway, and walked through the front door. Cynthia was sitting on the living room sofa, happily flipping through a bridal magazine. She looked up and smiled at me, a genuine look of completely unearned contentment on her face. She asked me how my afternoon drive was. I smiled back, looking her directly in the eyes. I told her it was incredibly productive. I walked past her, heading toward the kitchen to pour myself a glass of cold water. The wedding simply no longer existed, but the bride and the mother of the bride were still happily living in a ghost town. The swamp was drained, the dream was dismantled, and now it was time to address the final, most valuable asset they thought they owned. the $1.2 million roof over their heads. The following morning, I woke up before the sun even crested the horizon. I left Cynthia sleeping soundly under the expensive down comforter, her mind likely dreaming of the luxurious life she was about to steal from me. I brewed a pot of strong black coffee, grabbed my thick leather briefcase, and walked out to my truck. I drove through the quiet suburban streets as the neighborhood slowly began to wake up. My destination today was not a law office or a bank. I was heading to a sleek industrial business park on the far west side of the city. I was going to meet with the apex predators of the real estate food chain. In the commercial construction business, you learn to identify the corporate vultures. These are the aggressive, faceless investment firms that swoop in with millions of dollars in liquid cash to buy distressed properties, flip them, and aggressively evict anyone who stands in their way. They do not care about families, memories, or sentimental value. They only care about profit margins and immediate possession. For years, I had despised these kinds of companies. I believed they destroyed the soul of a community. But today, I desperately needed their absolute ruthlessness. I parked in front of a dark glass building bearing the logo of Vanguard Acquisitions. I checked the heavy deed to my home inside my briefcase one last time. It was a flawless, legally binding document, proving I was the exclusive owner of the property. I walked into the cold, minimalist lobby and was immediately escorted into a sterile conference room. Sitting across the long glass table was a man named Preston. He was the senior director, a man with sharp eyes and an incredibly expensive suit. He looked at me with the polite skepticism of a shark sizing up a potential meal. I did not waste his time with small talk. I slid the original deed, the current property tax records, and a professional appraisal report across the smooth glass surface. I told him I owned a prime piece of real estate in one of the most highly coveted suburban neighborhoods in the entire state. The current market value was safely set at $1.2 million. Preston scanned the documents quickly, his eyes lighting up slightly as he recognized the prestigious zip code. He leaned back in his leather chair and asked me why a successful contractor was looking to sell such a valuable asset to a corporate liquidator instead of listing it on the open market. I looked him dead in the eye and told him I wanted out immediately. I offered him a deal that no corporate investor could ever refuse. I would sell his firm the entire property free and clear of any liens for exactly $960,000. That was a massive 20% discount, essentially handing his company $250,000 in pure instant equity. Preston stopped taking notes. The room went completely silent as he processed the massive financial windfall I was offering him. He narrowed his eyes, searching for the trap. He asked me what the catch was. I kept my voice completely flat and void of any emotion. I told him there were only two incredibly strict conditions to this massive discount. First, the entire transaction had to be closed and fully funded in cash within exactly 48 hours. Second, his firm had to take absolute physical possession of the property exactly 1 day before this coming weekend. I explained that the house would be legally empty of my personal belongings, but there might be 2 unauthorized occupants remaining inside the premises who firmly believed they had a right to be there. I told him I needed a company that did not flinch at the prospect of an immediate aggressive eviction. Preston let out a low, dark chuckle. A predatory smile spread across his face. He assured me that Vanguard Acquisitions specialized in hostile takeovers. He explained their standard protocol for immediate possession. They did not wait for lengthy court battles or polite eviction notices. The absolute second the deed was legally transferred and recorded with the county clerk, they would dispatch a private security team and a crew of industrial locksmiths directly to the front door. They would change every single lockboard up the windows if necessary, and physically remove anyone trespassing on their newly acquired corporate asset. That was exactly the brutal, uncompromising, and terrifying force I needed to completely destroy their pathetic illusion of permanent safety. I reached across the glass table and firmly shook his hand, officially sealing the permanent fate of the Caldwell residence. Within 2 hours, his team of aggressive corporate lawyers had drafted a bulletproof purchase agreement. I signed my name on the dotted lines, officially transferring 15 years of history, memories, and equity to a faceless corporation. The cash would be wired directly into my offshore account by Friday morning, leaving Cynthia and Brittany standing in a house that no longer belonged to them. I walked directly out of the Vanguard building and drove back to the sprawling suburban house. I walked through the heavy front door and stood in the grand foyer. I looked at the glittering crystal chandelier hanging from the vaulted ceiling. I looked at the expensive Persian rugs and the custom silk curtains that Cynthia had so proudly picked out with my money. To her, this house was her permanent fortress. It was the absolute foundation of the wealthy, entitled identity she had meticulously crafted for herself and her daughter. But as I stood there listening to the faint sound of her humming happily in the kitchen, I knew the terrifying truth. The fortress was gone. The ground beneath their feet had already been completely hollowed out. They were simply ghosts haunting a corporate asset, and the new owners were already sharpening their knives, preparing to come collect exactly what was legally theirs to take. Thursday morning arrived with the bright, deceptive warmth of a perfect spring day. This was exactly 48 hours before the scheduled wedding and 24 hours before the corporate eviction team was set to arrive. Cynthia and Brittany had booked a luxurious all-day bridal spa retreat in the city. They were getting massages, facials, and manicures completely paid for by a credit card they still believed was fully active and linked to my rapidly vanishing wealth. I stood in the driveway and waved as Cynthia backed her expensive SUV out into the street. She blew me a kiss through the open window, telling me to enjoy my final day of peace before I flew out to Florida. I smiled my practiced harmless smile and watched the vehicle disappear around the corner. The absolute second they were gone, the smile dropped from my face. I turned around and walked back into the empty house. It was time to physically erase 15 years of my existence from these walls. I had already rented a secure climate-controlled storage unit 2 towns over, paying for a full year in advance with cash. Now I needed to pack. I walked into my home office first. This room was my true sanctuary, the place where I had drafted blueprints and negotiated contracts that built my entire commercial empire. I pulled a stack of heavy-duty moving boxes from the garage and began the methodical process of dismantling my life. I started with the mahogany bookshelves. I took down the framed photographs one by one. There was a picture of Cynthia and me on our honeymoon in Hawaii, both of us smiling brightly under the tropical sun. I looked at the woman in the photograph, trying to find the monster she had become, but I only saw the desperate, struggling mother I had sworn to protect. I felt a brief, hollow ache in my chest, a final mourning for the marriage I thought I had. I placed the photograph face down at the bottom of a cardboard box. I did not shatter the glass or tear the picture. The opposite of love is not violent anger. The opposite of love is total indifference. I moved to my solid oak desk and emptied the heavy drawers. I packed away my vintage drafting tools, the worn leather journals filled with decades of handwritten construction notes, and the silver retirement clock my old foreman had gifted me. Every object held a specific weight, a tangible piece of the man I was, before I allowed myself to be reduced to a clueless old man with a checkbook. I taped the boxes shut, grabbed a thick black marker, and labeled them quietly. I carried the heavy boxes out to my diesel truck, stacking them neatly in the truck bed. I went back inside and moved into the master bedroom. This was the most difficult room to dismantle, not because of the emotional attachment, but because of the sheer precision required. I had to pack my entire wardrobe, my personal documents, and my valuables without leaving the closet looking completely barren. If Cynthia came home and saw empty hangers and bare shelves, she would instantly panic and realize the trap had been sprung before the corporate buyers took legal possession. I carefully selected my favorite heavy denim jackets, my worn flannel shirts, and my durable work boots. I packed my expensive tailored suits, leaving just enough older clothing behind to maintain the visual illusion of a full closet. I opened my personal wooden valet box on the dresser and removed my grandfather's gold pocket watch, my wedding band, and the few pieces of jewelry that actually meant something to me. I left the expensive, flashy watches that Cynthia had bought me for various anniversaries sitting right there on the polished wood. They were bought with my money anyway, but I did not want any physical reminders of her hollow affection. I wanted to leave this house with exactly what I brought into it: my pride, my tools, and my unbroken spirit. The afternoon sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting long golden shadows across the hardwood floors. I walked through the house one last time, making sure I had not left anything important behind. I walked through the grand living room, past the expensive silk curtains and the crystal chandelier. I walked through the massive kitchen, pausing for a moment to look at the stainless steel trash can where Brittany had thrown my custom wedding invitation just 2 weeks ago. That single moment of profound disrespect had triggered an avalanche that was about to bury them both. I felt a deep, resonant calm settle over my entire body. I had spent 15 years trying to turn this massive structure into a loving home, but in the end, it was just wood, concrete, and glass. A house only holds value if the people inside it actually love each other. Without that, it is just an empty shell waiting to be sold to the highest bidder. I carried the final box out to my truck and secured the load with heavy nylon straps. I climbed into the driver's seat and started the rumbling diesel engine. I did not look back at the $1.2 million house as I pulled out of the driveway. I drove straight to the storage facility, unloaded my boxes into the dark, quiet unit, and snapped a heavy brass padlock onto the rolling steel door. My entire past was now safely locked away. I drove back to the house just as the sun was setting. I parked my truck, walked inside, and sat down in the heavy leather armchair in the living room. The house was perfectly silent. I was sitting in a corporate asset, waiting for the ghosts to return from their spa day. Tomorrow was Friday. Tomorrow morning, the absolute and terrifying nightmare would finally and officially begin for both of them. The front door clicked open just after 7 in the evening. Cynthia and Brittany floated into the foyer, their faces glowing from an entire day of luxurious spa treatments. They carried expensive shopping bags and chattered excitedly about the perfect weather forecast for the upcoming weekend. I remained seated in my heavy leather armchair, the picture of a tired but supportive father. Cynthia walked over and kissed my forehead, smelling of lavender and eucalyptus. She asked if I had managed to pack my bags for my early flight to Florida. I nodded, offering a gentle, reassuring smile. I told her I had everything neatly organized and was ready to get out of their way. We ate a quiet dinner together in the formal dining room. It was a masterful performance of domestic bliss. Brittany talked about Derek and how excited she was to finally walk down the aisle. Cynthia poured expensive wine, completely unaware that the bottle she was holding was purchased with an account that no longer existed. I chewed my food slowly, savoring the absolute surreal nature of the moment. They were celebrating a victory they had not actually won inside a house they no longer legally occupied. Every smile they flashed me, every sweet word they spoke, was just another nail in their own coffin. I did not feel an ounce of guilt. I just felt a profound sense of anticipation. When dinner was finished, I excused myself, claiming that my early morning flight required me to get a head start on my rest. I walked up the grand staircase to the master bedroom for the very last time. I pulled a small battered leather carry-on bag from the closet and packed a few remaining shirts and toiletries. It was a convincing prop for a trip I was actually going to take, just not the one they envisioned. Cynthia came into the bedroom an hour later, her silk nightgown flowing behind her. She looked at my packed bag sitting by the door and smiled softly. She climbed into the king-size bed and turned off her bedside lamp. I crawled in beside her, feeling the vast, cold distance between us. She reached out in the dark and rested her soft hand on my chest. She told me to have a wonderful time in Florida, and she thanked me again for being so incredibly understanding about everything. I turned my head and looked at her silhouette in the dim moonlight. I leaned over and kissed her cheek. It was a dry, hollow kiss. I told her goodbye, Cynthia. I told her I hoped she got exactly the wedding day she truly deserved. She closed her eyes and drifted off to sleep, within minutes, completely at peace with her monstrous deception. I lay awake for hours staring at the ceiling, listening to the rhythmic ticking of the hallway clock. The final inescapable countdown to their absolute and total destruction had officially begun. At exactly 3:30 in the morning, I silently slid out from under the heavy down comforter. I did not turn on a single light. I dressed in the pitch-black darkness, pulling on my heavy denim jacket and my worn leather work boots. I picked up my small carry-on bag and walked quietly out of the bedroom, leaving the door slightly cracked, just the way Cynthia liked it. The house was completely silent, heavy with the deep sleep of the oblivious. I walked down the carpeted stairs, each step bringing me closer to absolute freedom. I stopped in the grand foyer and looked around the shadowy living room. In just a few short hours, the corporate security team from Vanguard Acquisitions would march up the front walkway. They would pound heavily on the thick oak door, demanding immediate entry. They would hand Cynthia a legally binding eviction notice and give her exactly 1 hour to vacate the premises before they physically removed her and her daughter onto the front lawn. But before the corporate vultures arrived to pick the carcass clean, I needed to leave my own personal signature on this masterpiece of vengeance. I slowly walked past the living room and stepped into the massive gourmet kitchen. The moonlight spilled across the pristine marble island, illuminating the exact spot where this entire war had officially started. I set my bag down on the hardwood floor and unzipped the front pocket. I pulled out a thick, heavy manila folder. I placed it perfectly in the absolute center of the cool marble countertop. I wanted it to be the very first thing they saw when they came downstairs for their morning coffee. I opened the flap of the folder and meticulously arranged the contents. First, I laid out the $2,000 custom wedding invitation, the exact same one Brittany had thrown into the trash can. I had retrieved it, cleaned it, and torn it cleanly in half. Next to the torn invitation, I placed the comprehensive bank statements showing the completely drained joint accounts and the frozen credit lines. Beside those, I carefully set down a pristine copy of the unilateral divorce petition, heavily stamped and officially filed with the county clerk. Finally, I placed a bright red sticky note right on top of the pile. I pulled a pen from my pocket and wrote a short, simple message. It read, "I am just an outsider with a checkbook, and the checkbook is officially closed. Enjoy your special day." I left the folder resting silently in the moonlight. I picked up my bag, walked out the back door, and locked it securely and firmly behind me forever. I climbed into my heavy diesel truck, started the roaring engine, and drove away into the cool, dark, and quiet Texas morning. The final stage was now perfectly set. The trap was fully loaded and ready. All that was left to do was wait patiently for the warm sun to rise and watch the magnificent explosion. I parked my heavy diesel truck down the street, completely hidden beneath the sprawling branches of a massive willow tree. From this vantage point, I had a perfect, unobstructed view of the $1.2 million property that I no longer owned. The dashboard clock glowed quietly. It was exactly 10 in the morning on Saturday. The sky was blue, offering the perfect backdrop for their magical day. I rolled my window down a fraction, letting the crisp morning air fill the cab of the truck. I poured a cup of steaming black coffee from my steel thermos and settled into the worn driver's seat to watch the magnificent explosion. Exactly on schedule, a pair of pristine white limousines turned onto the quiet suburban street. They glided smoothly up the freshly paved driveway, gleaming under the bright Texas sun. The doors of the first vehicle swung open. Cynthia stepped out first, wearing an elegant, incredibly expensive mother-of-the-bride dress paid for by the ghost of my bank account. She smiled radiantly, her hair styled to absolute perfection. Next came Brittany, shielding her face from the sun, carrying her gown. From the second limousine emerged Derek, dressed in a sharp tuxedo, laughing loudly as he adjusted his silk tie. And right behind him was the ghost himself. Richard, the deadbeat biological father who had miraculously returned from the grave to claim his unearned glory. He looked incredibly comfortable in his tailored suit, soaking in the luxury that I had unknowingly financed. They stood together on the immaculate driveway, a picture-perfect portrait of a wealthy, happy family. They were completely ready to spend the entire morning taking professional photographs inside the grand foyer, sipping expensive champagne and getting dressed before the massive catering teams arrived. But as they began their triumphant march up the brick walkway toward the front porch, the radiant smiles on their faces began to falter. The atmosphere was completely wrong. Brittany stopped halfway up the path and looked frantically around the expansive front lawn. Her perfectly manicured hands gripped the sides of her heavy dress. She expected to see a small army of florists arranging imported roses. She expected to hear the clatter of catering crews setting up chafing dishes and carrying crates of expensive wine. She expected to see the massive white canvas canopy of the reception tent rising high above the backyard fence. But there was absolutely nothing. The property was completely barren. The lush green grass was perfectly cut, but it was entirely empty. No delivery trucks, no workers, no music. The suffocating silence of the suburban morning pressed down on them heavily. I watched through my binoculars as Derek pulled out his phone, his face twisting into a mask of angry confusion. He started dialing rapidly, likely trying to reach the venue coordinator or the catering company, completely unaware that those contracts had been legally annihilated 48 hours ago. Cynthia placed a reassuring hand on her daughter's shoulder, trying to maintain the fragile illusion of complete control. She probably told her that the vendors were simply running a little late. She confidently marched up the final few steps to the front porch, reaching into her designer handbag to retrieve her house keys. She stepped up to the thick oak front door and slid the familiar brass key into the lock. Or rather, she tried to. I watched her hand jerk violently. She pulled the key out, stared at it in sheer confusion, and tried to force it into the keyhole a second time. It did not even slide in. The delicate brass lock she was used to had been completely removed. In its place was a heavy industrial-grade steel padlock mechanism, bolted deeply into the solid wood and reinforced with thick metal plating. The corporate locksmiths from Vanguard Acquisitions had done a spectacular job. The door was sealed tighter than a commercial bank vault. Cynthia rattled the heavy handle. It did not move a single millimeter. Panic began to visibly spread across her powdered face. She dropped her designer bag onto the porch floor and began pounding her fists against the heavy wood as if sheer force could somehow bypass a corporate security upgrade. Derek jogged up the steps loudly demanding to know what was wrong. Richard stood nervously at the bottom of the stairs, suddenly looking very much like a man who realized he had walked into a dangerous trap. Brittany was bordering on full hysterics, shrieking about her hair and makeup schedule. Then Cynthia stopped pounding. Her eyes caught something she had somehow missed in her initial blinding panic. Taped directly to the center of the dark oak door right at eye level was a brightly colored, legally binding piece of paper. It was printed on harsh neon green cardstock designed specifically to be entirely impossible to ignore. It was the official notice of immediate eviction and corporate possession. I watched her lips moving as she read the brutal legal terminology printed on the page. The notice stated the property had been legally transferred, paid in full, and was now the exclusive corporate asset of Vanguard Acquisitions. It warned that unauthorized persons attempting to enter the premises would be arrested for criminal trespassing. It offered zero grace period. The window to vacate expired yesterday. The house was completely gone. Cynthia stumbled backward, her hand flying to her mouth in absolute horror. The color drained from her face. She looked like someone who had just watched the ground open up and swallow her reality. She turned to face her daughter, her future son-in-law, and her ex-husband. She had no explanation. She had no idea how an estate could just vanish overnight. She pulled out her cell phone, dialing the only person she thought could fix this massive disaster. My phone sitting on the passenger seat began to ring. I simply smiled, took a sip of my coffee, and let it go straight to voicemail. My phone sitting on the passenger seat began to ring. I simply smiled, took a sip of my coffee, and let it go straight to voicemail. Down on the driveway, the panic was rapidly escalating from quiet confusion to absolute frantic chaos. Derek paced back and forth across the pristine concrete, running his hands nervously through his perfectly styled hair. He looked like a cornered animal, realizing the walls of the cage were finally closing in. He argued loudly with Cynthia, pointing at the heavy padlock. His aggressive body language told the entire story. He was demanding answers that my completely terrified wife simply did not have. Richard nervously checked his gold watch and took a few slow steps backward, clearly calculating how quickly he could escape if the police arrived. But Derek was far too desperate to simply walk away. His massive gambling debts were breathing down his neck, and this house was supposed to be his ultimate financial salvation. I watched him storm off the front porch and march aggressively down the side path leading to the backyard. He was going to break in. He thought he could just smash a window, unlock a seated door, and magically restore the comfortable illusion they had been living in. I picked up my binoculars and followed his movements as he disappeared behind the tall wooden fence. It only took a few moments before I heard the sharp, unmistakable sound of shattering glass echoing through the quiet suburban neighborhood. Derek had picked up a heavy decorative landscaping rock from the flower bed and smashed it right through the sliding glass patio door. He reached his hand through the jagged shards of broken glass, unlocked the heavy latch, and slid the damaged door open. He stepped into the house, prepared to confront whoever he thought was playing a cruel prank on them. But the absolute second his expensive leather dress shoes hit the hardwood floor, his aggressive momentum completely vanished. He stopped in his tracks. The sprawling $1.2 million house was entirely silent, but it was a different kind of silence than he had ever experienced before. It was an echoing, cavernous hollow. The corporate extraction team from Vanguard Acquisitions had systematically executed their standard asset protection protocol. The massive leather sofas were completely gone. The expensive Persian rugs had been rolled up and hauled away. The custom silk curtains Cynthia had spent thousands of dollars on were stripped from the tall windows, leaving nothing but bare glass letting in the harsh morning sunlight. Even the massive crystal chandelier in the formal dining room had been safely unbolted and removed to protect the corporate investment. The house was completely stripped bare down to the absolute studs and drywall. Derek stood frozen in the empty living room, his breath catching in his throat. Every single step he took echoed loudly off the bare walls, sounding like gunshots in a hollow cave. The luxurious fortress he planned to steal had been completely vaporized. A moment later, Cynthia and Brittany rushed through the shattered patio door, desperately following Derek inside. Richard trailed cautiously behind them, his eyes darting nervously around the bare walls. As Cynthia stepped into the vast, empty living room, her designer handbag slipped from her trembling fingers and hit the bare hardwood floor with a dull thud. She let out a choked, ragged gasp. Her hands flew to her face, her eyes wide with unadulterated terror. She spun around in circles, desperately looking for any familiar piece of furniture, any remaining sign of the wealthy life she had grown so accustomed to living. But there was nothing. No family photographs on the mantel. No expensive vases on the hallway tables. Just expansive, unforgiving emptiness. Brittany began to cry hysterically, her loud sobs bouncing sharply off the barren walls. Her pristine white wedding dress dragged across the floor as she stumbled forward, completely unable to process the total destruction of her reality. She screamed at her mother, demanding to know who had done this on her special day. Cynthia could not even form a coherent sentence. Her entire body shook violently as the horrifying truth began to crush her. The clueless old man had not simply gone fishing, and he certainly had not flown to Florida. I watched through the bare windows as they slowly moved through the empty house like disoriented ghosts, eventually wandering into the massive gourmet kitchen. The kitchen was just as desolate as the rest of the house. The heavy oak chairs and the expensive appliances that belonged to the property were gone. But right in the dead center of the cold marble island, completely isolated in the massive room, was a cheap, flimsy plastic folding table. It was the only piece of furniture left in the entire building. The Vanguard cleanup crew had clearly ignored it, assuming it was just worthless trash. Derek walked slowly toward the table, his eyes locked onto the single item resting in the center of the white plastic surface. It was the thick manila folder I had carefully placed there at 3:30 in the morning. He reached out with trembling hands and flipped the heavy cover open. Cynthia and Brittany crowded closely around him, their faces pale with dread. Right on top of the neatly organized stack of legal documents was the brightly colored sticky note bearing my final handwritten message to them. Derek read the words aloud, his voice cracking with absolute panic. He read about the outsider with a checkbook. He read that the checkbook was officially closed. He pushed the sticky note aside with a trembling finger, revealing the item resting just beneath it. There, resting perfectly in the center of the file, was the $2,000 custom wedding invitation. The beautiful gold foil letters bearing Brittany's name caught the morning sunlight, streaming through the bare windows. The invitation was torn cleanly and perfectly in half, leaving them with absolutely nothing but their own greed. The silence in the barren kitchen was deafening as the reality of the torn invitation settled over them. But the masterpiece of my revenge was not quite finished yet. Cynthia reached out with trembling fingers and lifted the heavy manila folder off the plastic table. As she pulled it away, she revealed a second, slightly thinner folder resting directly underneath it. It was encased in a sleek, dark blue cover, the kind of professional binder used exclusively by high-end law firms. My attorney Mitchell had insisted on making the presentation as intimidating as humanly possible. Cynthia swallowed hard, her throat visibly bobbing. She slowly flipped open the dark blue cover. The very first document staring back at her was printed on thick legal paper, bearing the official seal of the Texas family court system. It was a formal, unilateral petition for immediate divorce. My signature was pressed firmly at the bottom of the page in dark blue ink. She read the brutal legal language outlining the absolute termination of our 15-year marriage. The petition explicitly stated that no spousal support would be offered and no alimony would be paid, citing severe financial betrayal and malicious intent. Cynthia let out a sharp gasp, her legs visibly shaking beneath her expensive designer dress. She quickly turned the page, desperately hoping to find some sort of financial settlement or a severance package. Instead, she found a highly detailed stack of official bank statements. These were not the doctored spreadsheets she had been using to track her stolen funds. These were the certified records directly from Texas Fidelity Bank. She stared at the bold numbers printed at the top of the page. The joint savings account, the account she had relied upon to fund her secret lifestyle and pay her deadbeat ex-husband, showed a current available balance of exactly $0.00. She flipped frantically to the next page, checking the status of the premium platinum credit card she had been carrying in her purse. The status was boldly listed as permanently frozen due to suspected fraudulent activity. Every single financial lifeline she had ever known was completely severed. The unlimited wealth she had enjoyed for a decade and a half had been legally evaporated into an offshore corporate entity that she could never possibly reach. She was standing in a pair of shoes she could no longer afford, staring at a bank balance that mirrored the absolute emptiness of her own soul. But the final document in the folder was the ultimate kill shot. Cynthia's manicured hands shook so violently that she nearly dropped the binder onto the plastic table. Resting beneath the bank statements was a crisp official copy of a federal police report. It was filed directly with the Federal Bureau of Investigation under the severe criminal charge of elder financial abuse, wire fraud, and medical forgery. Firmly stapled to the back of the federal report were the exact psychiatric evaluations she had paid Dr. Thorne to falsify. My lawyer had attached a highly detailed summary of their sinister plot to have me declared legally incompetent and thrown into a state-run asylum. The document explicitly named Cynthia Derrick and Richard as active co-conspirators in a massive coordinated racketeering scheme. The trap was not just financial, it was severely penal. They were looking at decades in federal prison. Derek leaned over Cynthia's trembling shoulder to read the federal document. The moment his eyes processed the bold letters spelling out wire fraud and federal investigation, his entire demeanor violently shattered. The arrogant, entitled groom completely vanished, replaced by a terrified, deeply indebted coward. His face turned the color of pale ash. He realized in that exact second that there was no $1.2 million house to inherit. There was no massive retirement portfolio to steal. The golden goose was entirely dead, and the federal authorities were actively hunting the foxes. Derek stumbled backward, bumping into the bare drywall. Brittany reached out to him, her face stained with black mascara, begging him to tell her what was happening. Derek looked at her with pure, unadulterated disgust. He violently swatted her hand away from his tuxedo jacket. He screamed that they were completely ruined, that her mother was an absolute idiot, and that he was not going to spend the best years of his life rotting in a federal penitentiary for a botched scam. He ripped the expensive silk boutonniere from his lapel, threw it onto the cold hardwood floor, and told Brittany the engagement was permanently canceled. Without looking back a single time, Derek sprinted out the shattered patio door, desperately fleeing the property to save his own skin. Richard watched the young man run away in sheer terror. The biological father, the man who was supposed to proudly walk his daughter down the aisle on my dime, did not hesitate for a single moment. He had survived his entire life by running away from his responsibilities, and he certainly was not going to stop now. He took one look at the federal police report resting on the table, turned on his heel, and sprinted straight out the front door, leaving his daughter behind for the second time in her miserable life. The heavy silence returned to the massive empty house. The corporate cleanup crew had removed everything, but the emotional devastation left behind was incredibly profound. Cynthia's knees finally buckled under the crushing weight of her absolute failure. She collapsed onto the bare hardwood floor, burying her face in her hands, sobbing with a deep, agonizing despair. Brittany slowly sank down onto the floor right beside her. The beautiful, immaculate white wedding dress pooled around her on the dirty, dusty floorboards. They were completely alone. The house was cold, barren, and unforgiving. They had absolutely no money, no home, no groom, and a massive federal investigation looming over their heads. I sat in my truck down the street feeling a profound sense of absolute peace. It was truly a masterpiece of revenge. The game was finally and completely over. I sat in my truck down the street feeling a profound sense of absolute peace. It was truly a masterpiece of revenge. The game was finally and completely over. I put the truck in drive and slowly pulled away from the curb, leaving the shattered remains of my former life in the rearview mirror. I did not drive back to the storage unit or to a local hotel. I drove straight onto the interstate highway, heading directly for the international airport. I parked at the airport, grabbing my small leather bag. Nobody around me noticed the quiet older man in the worn denim jacket. I smoothly breezed right through the busy security checkpoint and quickly made my way to the private airline lounge. A few short hours later, I was finally settling comfortably into a wide premium leather seat in the first-class cabin of a heavy commercial jet. The flight attendants offered me a warm towel and a crystal glass filled with premium aged bourbon over a single cube of clear ice. I thanked them and turned my attention to the window as the heavy wheels finally left the sun-baked Texas tarmac. I watched the sprawling suburban neighborhoods shrink into insignificant geometric shapes far below me. Somewhere down there in one of those tiny boxes, my ex-wife and her deeply spoiled daughter were sitting on a dirty hardwood floor, waiting for the federal authorities to knock on their shattered door. I reached into the inner pocket of my jacket and pulled out my cell phone. The screen was completely illuminated, overloaded with a constant stream of frantic notifications. Cynthia had called over 70 times, and Brittany 30. There were dozens of lengthy voicemails and a massive wall of hysterical text messages. I slowly unlocked the screen and opened the voicemail application. I pressed play on the very first message. Cynthia's voice blasted through the small speaker, completely distorted by her uncontrollable sobbing and absolute panic. She was begging me to answer the phone. She was screaming that a terrible mistake had been made, that Vanguard Acquisitions had completely destroyed the house, and that Derek had abandoned them. She pleaded with me to transfer money to her account so they could afford a hotel room for the night. She swore that she loved me and that she could explain everything if I just gave her a chance. I listened to her desperate lies for exactly 1 minute, feeling absolutely nothing but cold, hardened indifference. She was not crying because she felt remorse for her monstrous betrayal. She was only crying because her brilliant trap had suddenly snapped shut on her own neck. I did not bother listening to the rest of their pathetic messages. I pressed the power button, shutting the digital screen off completely. I popped the small plastic tray open with a pin. I carefully extracted the tiny digital subscriber identity module card, holding my personal phone number and all of my contacts. I held the small piece of plastic between my thumb and index finger for a long moment. That tiny chip contained 15 years of a fake marriage, thousands of fake memories, and the only remaining connection to a family that never truly existed. I held my crystal glass of bourbon up to the light. I opened my fingers and dropped the digital card directly into the amber liquid. It floated on the surface for a brief second, before sinking slowly to the bottom, coming to rest quietly beneath the ice. I took a very long, slow sip of the expensive whiskey, savoring the rich, smoky burn as it traveled down my throat. I leaned my tired head back against the soft leather headrest and watched the thick white clouds rolling past the window. I had a lot of time to reflect on the nature of family during this journey. Society tells us we must always forgive our family members. But I learned the hard way that blood and marriage certificates are not magical shields that excuse pure evil. Sometimes the people who claim to love you the most are simply the ones who have the easiest access to your vulnerabilities. True dignity requires you to look reality in the eye, recognize the venom, and have the absolute courage to cut the cancer out completely before it entirely consumes your soul. I did not waste the last 15 years of my life. I simply paid a very expensive tuition to learn an invaluable lesson about human nature. As for my own personal future, I have absolutely no intention of fading quietly into the lonely background. My offshore accounts are completely full, and the world is incredibly large. I plan to spend the next few years traveling across the globe, seeing all the magnificent places I was too busy working to visit. I am going to explore ancient streets and quiet mountains, but I will not just spend my wealth on myself. I am establishing a massive, well-funded educational foundation in my true hometown. I am going to use the money Cynthia tried to steal to build a commercial trade school for young, underprivileged men and women. I want to teach them how to work with their hands and build a genuine, honest life from the dirt up. I want to give them the exact same opportunity I had to create real value in this world instead of simply leeching off the hard work of others. The legacy of Harrison Caldwell will not be a cautionary tale of a foolish old man who was robbed blind. It will be the story of a master builder who knew exactly when to tear down a rotten structure and start entirely fresh. I lost 15 years, but I kept my soul. Did I go too far, or did they get exactly what they deserved? Leave your thoughts below, subscribe for more stories, and remember, never mistake a quiet old man for a weak one. See you next time.